So thank you all for coming and joining us in celebrating Dad and his life and work. As I'm just so you know, some of what I'm about to read, my sister Claire actually wrote for my father's eulogy, but I stole some of it because I thought it was a good intro. So anyway, as most of you know, Dad was sort of one of these larger-than-life characters, both literally and figuratively. To go along with his big stature, he had a big laugh, or as we would call it, a big guffaw. But his guffaw was just an outward sign of his big heart. But we know that Dad could be a curmudgeon underneath. Underneath all his cranking and complaining was a larger capacity for love. In his own home with 5 children and our various friends always traipsing through the house, he would bemoan the noise and commotion and say, "It's like Grand Central Station in here." But it seems he got great joy from watching his children grow up and hearing all about our exploits. And he would brag to people and tell stories about his wonderful children. He always wanted the details of our accomplishments and adventures, as he was happy to live his life sort of vicariously through his children. And while his love for his family was tremendous, there was room in Dad's big heart for the entire town of East Hampton. Aside from the goddamn tourists, as he would say, he loved everything about this town. He was fortunate enough to buy a house in East Hampton before it became the resort destination it is now, and he moved here to raise a family in the beautiful town that we live in, and took advantage of being of the outdoors by being on the golf course, taking long walks on the beach, and bird watching. And he also loved the people. As my sister Claire pointed out, he had his own precursor to the Facebook like button. It was the Clay Morey honk and wave. Many East Hampton residents were familiar with the experience of getting the beep beep from my dad as he drove past in his car. As he once said, it was his business to know everyone. I think he showed that love and appreciation of East Hampton through his work with the community, through his membership in the various boards that he was part of. And here tonight to speak a little bit more about Dad's involvement with the community is the current East Hampton Village Mayor, Mr. Paul Rickenbach.
Good evening, everyone. I was a little slow coming up the steps because in November I had a knee replacement. And as I say to many folks, and some who are in the same age bracket as I am, I came into this sphere with original parts. I had hoped to go out with original parts, but it didn't work that way. But it's a warm honor and pleasure for me to be here this evening to remember the life and memory of Clay Morey. Fran, you and I have had conversations recently and over the years, and it's nice to have family here, minus 2 of the daughters, I understand. Clay was a very complex individual. On the one hand, as Richard said, he had this gregarious laugh. I mean, when he came into the room and it was something that was said that made you laugh, he was there, you knew he was in the room. Just a wonderful spirit. There were bifurcated sections to Clay. He was the professional architect on the one hand, loved his discipline. Secondly, and probably first and foremost, he was a family man and loved his family just to the nth degree. And the third portion of the mix of the pie, if you will, was his service in local government. He was on the town planning board for a period, and specifically in the village of East Hampton, he joined the planning board in 1971. 1976, he was appointed chairman and served in that capacity until 1991. Coincidentally, he walked across the street that same year and became a member of our design review board. 92, he became the chairperson, and in 1997, he left the government service in the village. But I don't think in the annals of village government there'll ever be anyone who could state, as your dad could, that he was a chairperson of 2 separate boards, so that we were honored. I was a rookie mayor, and we connected more than once, and he would come in and have sheets and reams of papers. He says, "I've got a parking schematic that I think is going to change all the problems and issues in Rudishan," which is the big parking lot just behind the Main Street commercial corridor. And I'd look at it and I say, "Golly, Clay, you're right on target, but this is ideal and we're living in the real world." "Well, that doesn't make a difference," he says. But I appreciated his professional ability and the mentoring that he gave me when I first became an elected official. And that transcended through all the years that he was in government service in the village, and likewise yours truly. I was the beneficiary of having him as a personal and professional friend. On a lighter note, some of you may or may not know, you saw, I think, the screen a moment ago with the little model railroading. Clay was the consummate collector of model trains, Gorgie buses, Matchbox buses, Hess trucks, and that's a similar interest that we both enjoyed and we would talk about on occasion. A number of years back, there was a show that took place twice a year. It was called Goldberg. They had a who was Greenberg. They had shows twice a year, either at Hofstra University in the gymnasium or Stony Brook, and it was just a magnificent layout of all kinds of toys, trains, model planes, et cetera, et cetera. And on occasion, we would run into each other. So that's how multifaceted Clay was. I'm sure he's looking down on us this evening and saying, what's this all about? But we're doing this in tribute to him. And I'd just like to close by stating I think I'm a better person because Clay was a part of my life. Thank you, Clay.
So before I start the slideshow, I want to give you some background on the title slide that you see here. First, the image on the right is a drawing that appeared in the East Hampton Star in the late 1970s. It was drawn during a planning board meeting that Dad was part of. The drawing on the left was recently created by my talented cousin Richard White, who's here tonight, and that's the picture that keeps falling over down here is the original version that he brought with him tonight. When I was going through Dad's collection of stuff, I came across some books that he had put together of some of his work, and on one of them he had a title page that read, Clayton Phelps Morey, Architect, Planner, and Thinker. So that's where the title on the screen above comes from. Additionally, I found a list of places that Dad had worked as an architect, which was quite impressive and much more expansive than I was even aware. So in addition to working pretty much everywhere from Southampton to Montauk, he worked in Southold, Orient, Huntington, Manhasset, Hicksville, North Sea, Noyac, Remsenburg, and North Haven, and also worked in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Illinois, Michigan, and Kentucky. So that was, again, something that I learned. I mean, I learned a lot about my dad doing this project and putting this thing together, and that was one of the many things that I learned.
Dad was born on Valentine's Day in 1928. He was the only child of Sylvester and Minetta Morey. He grew up in Garden City and attended Lawrenceville Prep before moving on to Dartmouth College. He graduated from Dartmouth in 1949 and went on to study architecture at Columbia College in New York City. This is one of 8 images from Dad's thesis project while at Columbia. This is a bird's eye view of what I believe to be a fictional train station. As Mayor Rickenbach alluded to, and many of you were probably aware, Dad had a great fascination with trains, not just model railroads, but actual trains. Some of that may have been because he was not a person who liked to fly. My parents took a trip across country on a train, and while going through Dad's collection of slides, I found many, many pictures of both the inside and outside of trains.
This is a drawing that I found in Dad's stuff. I'm not sure if this was done for school or whether he did this on his own or whether this was a work project, but as with many of the things that I came across, it was something that I had not ever seen before, and so I thought it was interesting and wanted to include it in the show tonight. The same can be said for this picture of this parking garage. Again, I don't know the origin of this drawing, whether it was done as a work thing or a school thing or just something that, a doodle or something that he did. But again, I thought it was a pretty cool looking parking garage and thought it was interesting and worth including in the show this evening.
While Dad was attending night school at Columbia, he worked at Raymond Loewy, which was an industrial design firm in New York City. He was a draftsman and designer and worked there from 1952 until 1954. At a 1952 Christmas party, he met Frances White, who, as many of you know, became our mother. After meeting at a Christmas party in 1952, Mom and Dad were married in August of 1953.
And this is them, I believe, on their honeymoon? Yes, okay. This is on their honeymoon. Mom just confirmed that. After leaving Raymond Loewy following graduation from Columbia, Dad joined J. Gordon Carr, which is an architectural firm on West 40th Street in Manhattan. He worked there until June of 1958 when he left to start his own architectural firm, which was called Architectural Design Associates. So this is was taken from letterhead that I found actually in the collection of slides that he had. He had written notes about what was on the slides, and this was the paper that he had used. So I'm not sure who the other 2 architects were. As you see, there's no first name, it's just initials. This is the Architectural Design Associates logo and sign that was outside of their office. And on this next picture of the inside of the office, you can see part of the sign outside in the hallway. This is a picture of one of the architects, I presume one of the architects that Dad worked with, since this was taken inside the offices at Architectural Design Associates. Mom and Dad also began to spend time in the Hamptons sometime in the 60s in Amagansett and Montauk. This picture was taken by my dad in Montauk in 1962. And as you can see, it's quite different then than it is now. They eventually bought a house on Marine Boulevard in Amagansett, right on the beach, which is pictured here. And this is a picture of Mom and Dad and my grandmother, Morey, would be my father's mother. Sorry. So in the summer of 1964, my mother was pregnant with my sister Patricia. Dad spoke to a local architect about joining his firm. The architect was Alfred Scheffer, and I printed out 4 copies of an article from the East Hampton Star about Mr. Scheffer, who was apparently quite famous for designing a lot of the beach houses down in that area of Amagansett where Mom and Dad had been living, although it turns out many of those houses, I guess, have been torn down, so I'm not sure there's any in existence. And this was something that when doing some research in the East Hampton Star, I found this little blurb about Dad joining the architecture firm, which I thought was kind of neat. Mom and Dad moved from the beach house to a house on Buell Lane, which is where they raised their family. My brother Clayton, my sister Claire, and my sisters Patricia and Susan were all raised there, Susan being born in 1966. Just shy of a year after joining Alfred Scheffer, Dad set up his own firm, initially with offices on the second floor at 14 Main Street, which is where the J. Crew building is now, which had the fire a couple months ago. And again, this was in the Star, was something I thought was kind of interesting to see in the Star, this little sort of business brief, which I guess the Star still does these kind of things, but it was still neat to find a note like that in the paper. In 1967, he moved across the street to 35 Main Street, and in 1968, he partnered up with Frank Hollenbach, and I believe Mr. Hollenbach is here this evening as well. Mr. Hollenbach was a fellow Dartmouth and Columbia graduate, and he had recently moved to East Hampton. In 1986, my parents built an addition onto the house at David's Lane, which is the house where I grew up. They had to move there when I came along because the house on Buell Lane wasn't big enough. So anyway, Dad worked out of the office at David's Lane, and then again, when my parents sold the house, worked out of the home in Amy's Court before retiring sometime around 2006. But during the 50-plus years that Dad was an architect, he was involved with 31 office planning projects, over 200 renovations, and the design of approximately 75 new buildings, including the New York Athletic Club in Travers Island, New York, the First National Bank of East Hampton in Sag Harbor, which I think is now a Suffolk County National Bank, and the Associates and Farron building in Wainscott, which is just down the street from here and is actually the current town police headquarters. This was the sign that Dad had on the building at 35 Main Street. His offices, like at 14 Main Street, were on the second floor, and this sign was outside on the building next to the door to tell you to go in that door and go upstairs to his office. This is another logo that my father had designed at some point on paper, and he and I worked together to create this image that you see here, which is also included in some of the books over there. And I wanted to include this because this is one of my fond memories of my father was working on this together. We were using a piece of software at the time, which was quite advanced, called Text Twist, and it took us about 3 days to create this logo, which with something like Adobe Illustrator, I could bang out in about 15 minutes. But with old software and slow computers, it was a much more taxing process. This is another article from the Star, or a little blurb that was in the Star. This is in reference to an addition to a church in Southampton for which Dad was the architect. There's a notice about the addition being built and where the services are going to be held during the time of the renovation. This is the First National Bank in Montauk, which I did not realize Dad had designed, and that building is still a bank. I'm not sure what bank it is, but this, again, was a surprise to me. I did not know that he had designed this building, so seeing this in the newspaper was quite interesting. This is a church that Dad designed that I think was out of state somewhere. It wasn't near here, but it's reminiscent to the church in Amagansett, the St. Michael's Lutheran Church, which Dad designed as well. So as I mentioned, my parents moved to David's Lane in 1971, shortly before I was born, and this is how the house looked right when they bought it. and then they made some renovations to it, and this is how the house looked for most of the time that we lived there. Although, as I mentioned, in 1986, Dad built an addition on the right-hand side, which housed his office until my parents sold the house and then moved to Amy's Court. Oops. This is how the house looks today. The people who bought it from my parents added the swimming pool and all the brickwork. And coincidentally, it's currently on the market. It's listed with Sotheby's for $6.8 million. If anyone's interested, maybe I can get a commission. So now I'm going to move on to the cartoons and stuff that my father drew. So this first one is kind of straightforward. And I don't know if you can see the guy. This was done for Mack Truck when they were moving into their world headquarters in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Dad's firm had been retained to not only design the building, but also to plan out the offices. And this is a picture of a Mack Truck carrying the office on the back of the truck, and the driver of the truck saying to the guy, "Where do you want it, Mac?" This cartoon was drawn in April of 1973 when a proposal was put forth by the East Hampton Town Planning Board to create scenic green belts throughout the town. A public hearing was held at Town Hall, which was packed predominantly with local farmers who were the major landowners at the time and who would be most affected by the proposed law. The results of the hearing are evidence in the cartoon. And again, I don't know if you can read what the guy is saying, but it says, after very careful consideration and thought, the Town Planning Board has decided to reconsider the scenic greenbelt proposal. This cartoon, which again, unfortunately is a little bit difficult to read, is, as far as I know, the only one that he did that actually appeared in the newspapers anywhere. This was done at a East Hampton Town Zoning Committee meeting in Town Hall on May 14th, 1975, and appeared in the East Hampton Star sometime later. And the caption below reads, this was written by the people at the Star: "Clayton Morey, an East Hampton architect and a member of the Town Planning Board, was listening to the interminable proceedings at the town board meeting not long ago and turned out this doodle, which he presented to Supervisor Judith Hope at the end of the meeting. Mr. Morey may have been inspired by Town Attorney Dwayne Whelan's observation about the art of public relations and the office of the supervisor." And in the cartoon, I believe there's a large public relations office indicated on the top floor. Now, this cartoon, which, as you can see, is a can of worms, is one that I remember being up in Dad's office on 35 Main Street. So the background of this cartoon is that old file maps had existed in East Hampton Town for many years and were slowly and haphazardly being developed without any overall thought for long-range planning. In the mid-1970s, Mr. Armand DeRose, who was at the time the chairman of the East Hampton Town Planning Board, devised a system to alleviate many of the ills of the old file maps, so that in the end, the entire area would be improved with adequate and safe vehicular access to every dwelling for occupants within the old file maps. There were many problems, however, and this cartoon, which Dad presented to the Town Planning Board at the time, points out the bulk of these problems. And again, unfortunately, my vision is not very good, and you can't really read the captions on the can of worms coming out of, or the worms coming out of the can. This is very much Dad's sense of humor as well. This was a drawing done for a client who had a salt box in the 3 Mile Harbor area of East Hampton and wanted to put on a small addition. I don't know if you can read the caption. I believe the person is saying, "My architect thought this was just the small addition I needed." Apparently the house was never renovated in any way. No addition or anything was done. But the cartoon, according to Dad, prompted a hearty laugh from all those involved. And as we can all imagine, Dad's hearty guffaw was certainly one of those. So this is another cartoon, which unfortunately is funnier if you can read it. This is a spoof of the bureaucratic system that was in place in January of 1979, which was the last year that Dad was on the Town Planning Board. I don't know if you can read it, but the person is saying you can pick up your permit on the table, but just take care of everything else on top of it. And as you can see, there's 8 or 10 items that have to be taken care of, which were presumably application and approval processes that you had to go through before you could actually get your building permit to do whatever it was you wanted to do. This cartoon was prepared for Kenneth Westberg, who at the time was the mayor of East Hampton, and he owned the Golden Eagle paint store on Gingerbread Lane. He also owned properties adjacent to where the Golden Eagle paint store was, and this was a proposal, again, tongue-in-cheek proposal that Dad gave to him as an idea for how he could develop his property to maximize his income. In addition to those cartoons, Dad also liked to do drawings, and you'll see behind me an example of one, and I have some more to show you. But what he would do was go to job sites and get scrap pieces of wood that were, otherwise going to be thrown out, and he would paint them white and then draw on them in black ink and colored marker. So this is just an example of one of many of the things that he did. This next one is a cannon. This was on a white background, so I decided to take the white background out just to let the cannon itself stand out a little bit more. This is a fish, a large sailboat. Sorry, the last one that I have here is this group of people on a colored background. He did many of these, and there were some in the earlier slideshow that some of you may have seen. And I know my sister Patricia has a bunch of them up at her house now. And I remember in the house that we grew up in, on the stairs up to the second floor, there was a wall next to it, and that was covered with artwork, and it was primarily these plaques that Dad had done. Oh, sorry, this is the last one, this M, which I'm assuming was done as sort of a family emblem, obviously given that our last name begins with M. So as I mentioned, I also learned that Dad liked to paint it occasionally, which I did not know. I knew that his parents had both been painters, but was not aware that he had painted. So this painting is the building on 62nd and 3rd where Mom and Dad lived from 1953 when they were first married until 1962. And this, excuse me, this painting is actually still in a frame and up on the wall at my mother's house at Amy's Court. So again, as we've discussed, Dad was fascinated with all things trains. This is a sketch of a train engine, obviously, that he did. I assume this was done at architecture school because the caption at the bottom seems to indicate the class that it was done for. And then this is a colored chalk sketch of a train that he did as well. And again, it was interesting to me to learn that he worked with that media. I had always known about the plaques and obviously, pencil drawings and stuff as an architect, but didn't know that he painted or that he did chalk sketches. Continuing with the train theme, this is the monorail station at Disneyland. My parents took a trip by train to California, and of course, as I indicated, Dad took many, many pictures of trains that they passed on their trip, and trains and stations, and anything you can imagine, pictures of trains. And I thought this was sort of interesting because it was a monorail, and back at the time of this trip, that was probably pretty high tech. So this is one of, if not probably one of the first model railroads that Dad had. This is on the mantle at the apartment where Mom and Dad lived. I assume there wasn't an actual fireplace since it was New York City, but there was a mantle nonetheless, and he set it up with trains and Christmas. And of course, you can see the stockings with Clay and Fran's name on them. So then this is the beginning of a larger model railroad layout. Dad worked mostly with HO scale trains, although he did have a couple of Lionel trains at one point that I remember, but he was primarily worked with HO. And then this is that same train table with some of the scenery is fleshed out, and obviously there's some buildings there now, and of course the trains are on the tracks. I believe that this is the same train table just from a different direction, and it's decked out with a winter or Christmas theme. And actually many of these, the Christmas trees in this picture, my wife and I have, and we put them on our mantle at Christmas time. We don't have any trains, but we put them on the mantle to decorate for Christmas time. This is the model railroad that Dad built at the 3rd floor in the David's Lane house. This railroad, I know from playing with it, so to speak, with Dad, he named it the T-square and triangle line, which of course is architectural references. Now, I don't know if all of his train model railroad layouts were named that, or he came up with that at David's Lane. But the other thing that I remember about the model railroads, and again with the David's Lane specifically, since bless you, was I think Dad enjoyed the process of building the railroads as much as he did sort of playing with them or anything. And I don't think he ever really wanted to be finished building them. I think the joy was in the process of building out the railroads, because it seemed like he was always changing his idea or changing his mind about the layout and the tracks and all like that, and he would rip stuff down and build new stuff. So I think it was more, just maybe an escape to some extent, but I think it was sort of, therapeutic maybe or whatever, and he liked working on them and didn't want to be done with them because, what would he do next? this is a crossword puzzle that appeared in the East Hampton Star on March 31st, 1977. And again, I don't know if you can read it, but highlighted in yellow, 31 across, is the clue, well-known Bonic architect, Clayton blank. And the answer is 5 letters, so I think it's pretty obvious who they're talking about. So this cartoon was drawn by a local cartoonist, Warren Whipple, who Dad had become friends with in East Hampton and then also worked for as an architect at some point. Dad believes that the accompanying cartoon was inspired by a conversation that he had had with Mr. Whipple, although he doesn't recall specifically the conversation. Again, I don't know if you can read it. It's a couple looking at a very run-down house, and then in the bottom frame, it's, you can barely recognize the house that was there originally, but it says, now with a few renovations, can you find the original salt box? And it says, thanks to Clayton Morey, East Hampton, Long Island. This is a letter that was written to the Star by Cy Schutz. The gist of it was that Dad was not reappointed to some board, and Cy Schutz was critical of the town board for not reappointing Dad, and sort of bullet pointed all the great things that Dad did while he was on the board. And Dad said that it was a surprise and an honor for me to see, and a very humbling experience at the same time. It was written by a truly great man who was sorely missed. And also it appeared in the February 14th, 1980 issue of the Star, which would have been Dad's 52nd birthday, as he was born on Valentine's Day. And then finally, this is another original cartoon that Dad did that I thought I would end the show with. There's 2 versions of it, but this is the first one. This was done in early 1980 following a major change in the East Hampton Town Board. Very more stringent rules were put in place regarding development and land use, and that inspired Dad to create this cartoon. However, after a few short years later, with even stricter laws enacted, he updated the cartoon so that it now says no admittance as opposed to residents only. And I thought this was sort of funny and perhaps appropriate to end with this cartoon, because I don't know if any of you heard, recently in Belmar, New Jersey, there was some kind of special event there where a lot of, as Dad would say, damn tourists came into town. And the mayor announced that the main road into town, Route 35, which would be like Montauk Highway to us, was going to be shut down immediately because the Monmouth County community has reached its capacity. However, residents were allowed back into the town. They just had to provide ID that showed they lived there. And I gather once the event was over and all the damn tourists left, traffic was opened up again back to the area. So that's basically it. As I mentioned to many of you, there were a lot of slides and a lot of things that I came across, and I'm going to post the video of this presentation as well as all of the other stuff online, so you guys can look at them take more time or read them or whatever. But again, thank you all for coming, and there is wine and cheese and stuff over here and things, like I said, about Dad that you may be interested in reading. Some of the cartoons actually are over here in the book, that if those of you with good eyesight, you can read the captions right there. I probably can't read them myself, but again, thank you all for coming.